The goal of this exercise is to practice how to write an abstract for a scientific result, report, or article. Um, so the prompt is to imagine an experiment designed to measure the total amount of torque required for a wrench to unscrew a hex nut from a hex bolt that are rusted together. Create an abstract from the following pieces of information. So these 6 pieces of information below contain the basic elements of the experiment. And before writing an abstract, the basic elements of the experiment should be known, including the key results and why the experiment is interesting. The first piece of information is the hex nut and bolt have been exposed to the elements in Southern California from October to March. So we can imagine it's going to take quite a bit of torque to wrench the nut from the bolt because they're stuck together with friction and rust. The hex nut and bolt are attaching a metal flange to a wall, so they're sitting, they're penetrating a vertical surface. Now, specifically, torque is like force, but it's the kind of force that twists. So torque is the amount of force applied in a twisting manner against a lever arm. So in this case, the lever arm is the length of the wrench. If you can imagine a wrench attaching to a bolt and then pulling on the wrench, there would be no torque if you simply pulled the wrench directly away from the screw or the nut or bolt that you're trying to twist. Similarly, if you just pushed against the wrench, there would also the wrench would simply push back against the bolt. There'd be no twisting. But if you pull at a 90-degree angle, then let's say you pull clockwise, then that's tightening the nut or the screw or whatever. But if you twist or pull counterclockwise, then that usually loosens the screw or the nut. And so specifically, the torque is the amount of force that you apply in the twisting fashion times the length of the wrench. So if you have a much longer wrench, you won't need as much force to apply to that screw or nut. But if you have a really short wrench, it's kind of hard sometimes to twist something that's stuck. This is also why we place the doorknob at one end of the door, one side of the door, so it doesn't take as much effort to pull that door open. Imagine if the doorknob was in the middle of the door, right? Then now the lever arm is shorter and it takes more force to pull the door open. A torque wrench is attached to the nut such that it extends horizontally away from the nut. So if you're facing the wall, then the nut and bolt are sticking into the wall, and then that means the wrench is horizontal with respect to the ground. So it's all we have to do is apply a force, let's say downwards. So this would means that the wrench is on the left side of the nut, and we apply a force downwards, and it will untwist the nut, and it'll release the bolt from the wall, and we can remove the object. So we decided to do an actual experiment or be scientific about it and determine the exact amount of torque required to do this. So a piece of twine is tied to the end of the wrench, and increasing amounts of weight are hung from the other end of the twine. When the wrench finally twists the nut, the necessary torque would be the weight in newtons or pounds times the length of the wrench, which we assume here to be 15 centimeters. And so I guess we have to specify the weight necessary. And let's say, so point of order, by the way, that let's say if it was 2.2 kilograms of mass, but then that turns out that's about 20 newtons. Let's say 21 newtons. A newton is a unit of force, and that's different from mass. But the point is, you can convert that to pounds, and that may be more familiar, the British units. But the point is, the result has to be known along with the rest of the story. So we're here to write an abstract. So one of the first important pieces of information to include in the abstract is why, or why is this interesting or important. Um, and so you could begin by saying something like, um, in home construction, it is important to know how materials will behave in the elements. I could also clarify by saying outdoor elements. Um, Beginning an abstract this way, you begin very generally, and it's important to draw the reader in to convince them that it's interesting. Sometimes people read abstracts and they stop by the second or third sentence because they don't believe that it's interesting or that doesn't sound like something new or was done. So imagine you're doing this at home, where you'd actually want to know how much force will be required when you're loosening something. That would determine what kind of tools you would choose or how you would go about this process. And so uh, the point is, you do want to write in passive voice, but you want to write very strong passive voice so that it's not personal, but it is still strong and interesting. So I've begun my abstract by saying in home construction, so a general thought or idea, it is important to know. I'm telling the reader that this is important. How materials will behave in the outdoor elements. So that's logically what's going on here. That's the big idea. Um, so in this contrived example, that's as big as I can get, but you want to get as general as possible and then move to um, the more specific ideas at the end. Um, so I can move on in the paragraph by saying, in particular, um, the torque required to, or how about the effect of rust on the torque required to loosen nuts and bolts directly pertains to, let's say, home repair. Uh, I want to tie it to the age or the time that like it says in the first piece of the first bullet point, from October to March, or a length of time. So in particular, the effect of rust on the torque required to loosen nuts and bolts directly pertains to home repair in older construction sites. How about just pertains to repairing older homes? Older here is an example of an ambiguous word. It's a little too general. I would replace it with something else. We could go with um, homes older than, we could say more than a decade. We could say more than several decades. Repairing, actually, how about this? Repairing homes built more than 30 years ago. Um, Maybe in the past. So this is not strictly sticking to the concise writing techniques, where I am adding an extra sentence, but it's again to make the reader, convince the reader that this is interesting. In particular, the effect of rust on the torque required to loosen nuts and bolts directly pertains to repairing homes built more than 30 years ago. Um, that 30 might be kind of arbitrary, but as it turns out, many homes in Southern California are at least 30 years old, if not much older than that, maybe 50 years old. And in some cases, the affordable ones are 100. So this is something that is practical. 30 would be like an average. Um, so what pieces of information have we um, included so far? So we've included the first bullet point to some extent, but we haven't been specific. We're not yet to the specific part of uh, the abstract yet. So it's time to again get more specific in this first pass. So how about to examine uh, the effect of rust on required torque? Actually, it's more important to define torque ahead of time. So torque. How about yes, torque um, is a force applied in a twisting motion in order to rotate an object and is equal to the force applied to a I want to include the idea of a wrench here. So uh, torque is, let's be more specific. So we've begun the paragraph generally, but we're sort of out of general sentences. We need to get more specific. So torque is the force applied um, to the edge of the wrench, or how about a wrench, in order to twist a bolt or nut. Um, and I'll say period. Specifically, it is, and I say it is because I don't have to say the torque is equal. That's an extra word. I'm still talking about torque, so the sentence follows the next one, and I say specifically just to be sure about that. So specifically, it is the torque equal to the force applied, um, and then times the length of the wrench. So specifically, it is equal to the force applied times the length of the wrench. Um, so now we've got our definition of torque. We've started generally, gotten more specific. We've defined a necessary vocabulary word, or torque. So you see, we've included now this third bullet point here, third and fourth bullet point. So the fourth bullet point we need to use now. So how about and also the first one, a hex, nut, and bolt. In fact, let's just copy the first bullet point in to the abstract. Now let's format it a little bit. Instead of saying the hex nut, because they don't know what you're talking about at this point, so a hex nut and bolt, and then I think I want past tense. Now, so here's an example of where you have to selecting the tense is important. So um, up to this point, this is all in the present tense passive voice. So if you look at this for this first sentence, for example, it is important to know that is in the present tense, but that's because that idea is not a changing idea. It's not a recent idea. That's usually true. Torque is the force applied. That's not even in passive voice, actually. Torque is the force applied to the edge of the wrench in order to twist a bolt or nut. But that's also an idea that will never change. That's just the definition of torque. And so we don't need to do past tense or even passive voice in this particular sentence. When we say specifically it is equal to the force applied, again, that's not a changing idea. Now, when we get to the specifics of the experiment, I think we need to move to passive voice in the past tense. So a hex nut and bolt were exposed to the elements in Southern California from October to March, let's say 2019 to 2020. How about October 2019 to, and I think I'll just say it like this in parentheses, to March 2020. Um, in March, how about we say a torque, specifically a torque wrench was attached to the nut at such that the length of the wrench was horizontal with a downward force serving to untwist the nut from the bolt. So that sentence is crucial. That's a very specific sentence. In March, a torque wrench was attached to the nut such that the length of the wrench was horizontal. So this is what? What skill is that from the class so far? That's spatial detail, right? Spatial detail is absolutely critical in writing abstracts because you're trying to communicate a lot of information in a short amount of time, and you can't make a mistake in your temporal or spatial details. You can clear it up or add more detail later on in the paper, but if someone gets the wrong idea from the abstract, the game is over. You have no chance of clarifying or convincing them later, unless they read the paper twice. But the point is, you really ought to win first in the abstract and then later drive the point home in the paper. Some of the best papers ever written have a really good abstract, and they might not have a perfect body, but they really pull you in, and they know exactly what they're doing. Um, Papers sometimes have very, very long abstracts, and that just makes them impossible to understand. They included all the information in the abstract, and then uh, you read the abstract and then you read the paper, and there's a lot going on, and you don't know what the point was. That's more common than you might think. So abstracts should be short. They should include, when necessary, spatial and temporal detail. Notice we've used um, temporal detail here, so things like past tense, so we're exposed to the elements in Southern California, a spatial detail from October to March, right? So about 6 months. So that's temporal and spatial details are becoming more common throughout the paragraph as the paragraph moves from general to specific. So in home construction, we start very generally, and now we're talking about the exact direction that the wrench was positioned. So, and in fact, I say positioned. Well, I think was attached to that such that the length of the wrench was horizontal. I think that still does the same job. So, with a downward force serving to untwist the nut from the bolt. Now, weights. Um, I want to communicate the idea of successively more weight. Um, how about an increasing amount of weight? I could say increasing weight was strung from the twine or something, but that sounds a little vague. So an increasing amount of weight is a little more specific, but at the cost of a few more words. So an increasing amount of weight um, was hung from the end of the wrench with twine. I just realized I did not specify the length of the wrench yet, so that needs to be included. I do not need another sentence. I know that the wrench is 15 centimeters long. I can just say, I can put it in this sentence that begins with in March, so a 15 centimeter torque wrench. If you put it there, then the reader knows what that means. A 15 centimeter torque wrench was attached to the nut such that the length. So, um, I'm just going to say such that the wrench was horizontal. The length of the wrench, and that says the same thing. An increasing amount of weight was hung from the end of the wrench with twine. The nut became loose, and the wrench. How about we could just say How about we just say the focus on the wrench? The wrench began to rotate the nut. Am I writing in passive voice right now? Um, was attached with a downward force and increasing amount was hung. Um, so I should stick with that. So the nut was rotated by the wrench once um, when let's say 21 newtons of how about when a force of 21 newtons was applied to the wrench. And I can delete by the wrench because to the wrench comes at the end. So when the nut was, you don't need to say the wrench twice in the same sentence. The nut was rotated when a force of 21 newtons was applied to the wrench. And so you multiply those two numbers, 15 centimeters times 21 newtons. What 15 centimeters should be put in uh, meters? That's 0.15 times 21. So 3.15, making the necessary torque 3.15 Newton meters. That's how whenever you multiply two things with units, you just say both units, Newton meters. You don't need to know that for the that will come if you take physics. But the point is, we're sticking the result of the experiment at the end. The nut was rotated when a force of 21 newtons was applied to the wrench, making the necessary torque 3.15 Newton meters. So have we included all pieces of information from the bullet points? Well, yes, we included the hex nut from October to March. The hex nut and bolts are attaching a metal flat. That detail turned out to be not so important, just as long as the reader understands that uh, the well, okay, so then they don't know. So someone actually, this is kind of a problem. Someone reading this abstract would not at first know that the bolt was sticking into a wall, and so hanging weight from the wrench, if you can imagine spatial detail, um, might not be enough here. Let's go back to the sentence where we are including spatial detail meant to explain the picture to the reader. In March, a 15 centimeter torque wrench was attached to the nut, such that the wrench was horizontal with a downward force serving to untwist the nut from the bolt. So that if you know how a bolt works, then that automatically implies that the bolt is sticking into a wall, right? Because if the bolt was up and down, then you would need to pull back and forth to untwist it, not down to untwist it. So it's a matter of the geometry. Um, it wouldn't hurt to include one more detail. So a hex nut and bolt. How about screwed into an exterior wall? Something like that. A hex nut and bolt screwed into an exterior wall were exposed to the elements in Southern California. So some spatial detail to indicate that the nut and bolt system is going into a wall, or that it's horizontal with respect to the ground, so that when you twist it, you have to pull down to untwist it. Okay, so let's examine this paragraph again. Are we including all pieces of information? A piece of twine is tied to the end of the wrench. We don't really need to talk about the twine so much, just an increasing amount of weight was hung from the end of the wrench with twine. That's enough. We've said enough on about that bullet point. And then our final result is the final bullet point, so we needed 21 newtons times 15 centimeters, and then that's actually, 15 centimeters is 0.15 meters, so you multiply, 0.15 times 21, that would give you the torque. Okay, so the point is, if you look at these sentences right here, I'll put them in italic. Those sentences are in the present tense. They are not. They're still passive, but they are general and in the present tense, and so they're not talking about specifically what we did in this experiment. They're talking about things that should be true in general or broadly. Um, I'll put the second half of the paragraph in bold. Um, and in bold, when you see something in bold, that's uh, where we get into the specific details of the actual study that was done. And so uh, the bold should definitely come after the italic. That's part of the art of writing an abstract. Okay, so we're going to remove this formatting now. And there. So the second thing that I want to say is that the second point about abstract writing is, can you make it shorter? So really just the same as our good old concise writing techniques. This is hard. In abstracts, you're trying to convey lots of information in a short amount of time, and so that means the information density is very high. Uh, every word you cut is a potential reader lost, and so the point of the abstract is to draw in the reader, convince the reader that it makes sense and that it's interesting, but don't overwhelm the reader with too much. It's an art form, so let's find a phrase that we can cut. Um, in home construction, it is important to know how materials will behave in the outdoor elements. Maybe you can get away with saying outdoor, deleting outdoor, just saying in the elements. Uh, in particular, the effect of rust on the torque required to loosen nuts and bolts directly. Um, so I think maybe we don't need the phrase in particular. Let's see how it works without that. In home construction, it's important to know how materials will behave in the elements. The effect of rust on the torque required to loosen nuts and bolts directly pertains to repairing homes built more than 30 years ago. I don't know if there's anything we can cut there because the whole point of this experiment is that the rust has increased uh, the um, the torque required, and the torque required to unloosen a non-rusted stainless steel nut and bolt would be anything. It's you tighten it to some torque, and it takes that torque to untighten it more or less. And so, um, but the rust here has an effect that you have to break the chemical bonds of the rust. So that's an important sentence. The effect of rust on the torque required to loosen nuts and bolts um, directly pertains to repairing homes. Um, how about we just remove, since I think the phrase built more than 30 years ago could be thought of as speculative. Definitely it's more relevant to the homes that are several decades old. Uh, but it could potentially be relevant to a home that's a year old if the bolt is on the outside. In fact, this particular measurement would apply to not a bolt that's been exposed for 30 years, but a bolt that's been exposed for 6 months because it was under a controlled experiment. So the effect of rust on the torque required to loosen nuts and bolts directly pertains to home repair. Um, how about home repair here? Um, Then, torque is the force applied to the edge of a wrench in order to twist a bolt or nut. Do we need both sentences? So torque is the force applied to the edge. Specifically, it is equal to the force applied times the length of the wrench. Um, I think that we could actually, we might be able to just make this dramatic cut here. Uh, just torque is the force applied times the length of the wrench. Um, so yeah, we'll see. We'll come back to that later. But let's see if the paragraph makes sense with just that sentence instead of the two sentences. So we've cut like most of the first sentence and merged those two. That, by the way, was one of our concise writing techniques. Um, merge sentences. Merge sentences that have that say the same thing. So if you saw what I did there, those sentences were both about torque, the definition of torque. And so one was a little bit more general, one was more specific and mathematical, or at least giving you kind of an equation, force times length. So let's just stick with the more quantitative sentence and then see if that works. The effect of rust on the torque required to loosen nuts and bolts directly pertains to home repair. Torque is the force applied times the length of the wrench. So this is okay. So there is a problem that was too much of a cut. The torque is the force applied uh, um, by a wrench. How about applied to a wrench times the length of the wrench? So times the length of the wrench. I'll say comma as it loosens a nut from a bolt. So let's say let's use that single sentence, but we've added a little bit to it. So we used to have two sentences there, but now we cut one of them, but now we've added a little bit more to the sentence that remains. So hopefully that's a little bit better. Because if you just say the force applied blank, then the reader naturally asks what to apply to what. So torque is the force applied to a wrench times the length of the wrench as it loosens a nut from a bolt. A hex nut and bolt screwed into an exterior wall were exposed to the elements in Southern California from October 2019 to March 2020. In March, maybe it's a good idea to say in March 2020. Uh, they could be thinking of the previous March, I guess March 2019 or something. So in March 2020, a 15 centimeter torque wrench was attached to the nut such that the wrench was horizontal with a downward force serving to untwist the nut from the bolt. Maybe from the bolt is not necessary there because it's implied. Nuts only attached to bolts, so we can cut that. An increasing amount of weight. I'm tempted to go back to saying it the original way. Increasing amounts of weight were hung. An increasing amount of weight was hung. Nope, that's as small as it gets. I changed my mind. If you say something like increasing weight was hung from the end of the wrench, uh, increasing what? Like the amount of weight or um, are you increasing the length, like the distance from the center? There's a chance that the reader wouldn't know what that meant. It also doesn't sound like good English, like just increasing weight was hung. Um, uh, Amount is the quantitative word there that we need. You could also be really draconian and just say weight was hung from the end of the wrench with twine. But then you lose the idea of increasing. So if like, let me give you an example. So if we just cut this phrase here, weight was hung from the end of the wrench with twine. The nut rotated when a force of 21 newtons. So you're calling it weight in one sentence and force in the other sentence, and technically those are the same thing, but not everyone knows that. And so so an increasing amount of weight gives you the idea that of what we're actually doing. And in fact, this is kind of a subtle temporal cue here. An increasing amount, that's a temporal detail. So pay attention to um, my technical description, 1 and 2 techniques. So spatial and temporal details. So an increasing amount of weight was hung. That indicates the time, the flow of time. We tried this weight, we tried the next weight, we tried the next one, then finally the wrench, uh, you know, popped the bolt from the wall by loosening the nut. So the point is um, you need to indicate the flow of time there somehow, and you don't want to say like first we tried this weight, second we tried this weight, because that's what belongs in the body of the paper. The abstract says the same thing, but in as short of a space as possible. So an increasing amount of weight was hung from the end of the wrench with twine. Do we need to say twine? Do we need to say what kind of rope was used at all? The answer is no, not in the abstract. Um, Let the reader imagine what kind of string was used. If it was not strong enough of a string, like if you used fishing line, maybe it would not be enough. Uh, but apparently not, because it didn't break. So just let the reader, imagine what kind of string you used. We'll clarify that in the paper. The nut was rotated when a force. Um, we could also say the nut began to rotate. That's technically adding a word, but we're also indicating the flow of time. So an increasing amount of weight was hung until. In fact, that's actually an interesting. Well, that would make the sentence very long, but why not? Let's try it. Um, an increased amount of weight was hung from the end of the wrench, comma, until the nut began to rotate. Um, I like that better. That includes the flow of time with spatial and temporal details. So you're hanging it from where? The end of the wrench. And what's the flow of time? Well, you're adding weight until. So I like that word until. That's a very useful word there. Until the nut began to rotate. Um, let's see. So we're going to have to modify this last sentence now because it's no longer complete. A force of 21 newtons. Um, how about the final force applied was 21 newtons. Applied, you have to say that twice, and it's clear the only force for applying is to the wrench, so bye-bye to that phrase. The final force applied was 21 newtons, making the necessary torque 3.15 newton meters. Notice this paragraph has gotten shorter, so therefore it's concise, but it also has spatial and temporal detail, and we didn't really touch um, much the general ideas in the beginning of the paragraph versus the specific details in the second half. So we didn't mix those. That separation remained. That there's a beginning and an end, the general and the specific. So the only thing missing from this abstract would be some form of hyperbole or some form of like catchy phrase, like something like this. Uh, this was the first time that you know or something like, usually in science there's some reason that people are doing this new experiment, and so you have to tie it all together, or you have to say why it's important. um, Sometimes people will add a sentence like uh, this result uh, this result is useful because future tool design, etc. Like, just something like some phrase that shows the reader that this research is going somewhere. That's not always necessary, but if the research is groundbreaking, sure, you should definitely include that. So that may be commonplace in my field, but it's not always the case in everyone else's. So this has been practice writing an abstract, or how to write an abstract. So this was more of an example. Please see the week 5 lecture notes for more details. Thank you.